Attention Formula One fans. Could Mercedes have issued a warning that will change the future of the grid? The potential elimination of the 2026 regulations could put teams like Williams, McLaren, and Alpine in jeopardy. What's really going on? Stay until the end because we're taking a deep look. In this video, we'll explain what's at stake, how teams could be affected, and what consequences this would have for the Formula One championship. Do you think the FIA will make a decision that will benefit everyone or just the most powerful teams? For several years, Formula One has been working on new engine regulations that would come into effect in 2026. The main objective of these regulations is to make cars more efficient, sustainable, and less dependent on fossil fuels, while maintaining competitiveness on the grid. The new rules propose a significant change in the proportion of energy used. The goal is to reduce the environmental impact of engines by increasing the power generated by the electric component of the hybrid propulsion system and reducing dependence on the internal combustion engine. The idea is for cars to be more efficient without losing the level of performance that characterizes the category. Furthermore, the 2026 regulations propose a reduction in the use of the MGUH, the component responsible for recovering energy from the heat generated by exhaust gases. This change has been one of the reasons why brands like Audi have decided to enter F1, as it simplifies the development of power units and reduces costs for manufacturers. The problem arises because some teams and manufacturers are beginning to question whether these regulations will truly achieve the promised balance or whether they could benefit certain competitors over others. There are rumors that Red Bull and Honda have made significant progress with their 2026 engines, which has raised alarm bells throughout the rest of the grid. On the other hand, development costs have been a sticking point. Teams like Williams, Alpine, and McLaren have planned their futures around these rules, investing resources in research and strategic alliances to be ready when the regulations come into effect. An unexpected change in leadership at the FIA could mean all that work becomes obsolete overnight. But here comes the most critical point. If the 2026 regulations are amended or scrapped entirely, smaller teams or those that have based their strategy on this change would be at a significant disadvantage. Meanwhile, teams with greater resources like Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes could adapt more quickly, maintaining or even expanding their dominance in the series. And this is what has led Mercedes to issue a strong warning about the consequences of scrapping these regulations at the last minute. But how real is this threat, and how could it directly affect teams like McLaren, Alpine, and Williams? If the 2026 regulations are cancelled or drastically modified, the teams that have most invested in their implementation could be at a significant disadvantage. Williams, McLaren, and Alpine are three of the teams that have planned their development and strategies based on these rules, meaning any unexpected change in the FIA's direction will have a direct impact on their short and medium-term projects. Williams, under its new management, has been working on a complete restructuring of the team. Investment in infrastructure and the search for strategic partners have been key in its attempt to return to competition at the front of the grid. Part of that strategy has included a strong commitment to the 2026 engines, ensuring its structure is aligned with the changes that would allow smaller teams to compete on equal terms with the giants of the sport. If the regulations are reversed or delayed, Williams could be left without a clear plan, having to readjust its technical and financial approach without the resources that other larger teams can afford. McLaren, on the other hand, has been on a growth path that led it to win the Constructors' Championship in 2024. Its strategy has focused on evolving its chassis and optimizing its engine, with an eye toward the new era of Formula One. If the FIA decides to scrap the 2026 regulations, McLaren could face a scenario in which the strategic advantages they had planned for are no longer relevant. Even worse, this would mean that rivals who have been less committed to the regulatory changes would have the opportunity to maintain their advantage without being forced to adapt to new regulations. In Alpine's case, the situation is even more delicate. Renault has been one of the manufacturers that has pushed the new engine regulations the hardest, aiming to regain competitiveness in the hybrid era of Formula One. The team's technical structure has been focused on developing an engine that adapts to the new rules, meaning that any unexpected changes could render all the investment made in recent years worthless at an instant. Furthermore, the lack of a customer team to use its power unit means Alpine is solely dependent on its own success, so a reversal of the regulations could leave the team in a very compromised position compared to other teams with stronger alliances. The most worrying aspect for these teams is not only the investment they could lose, but the fact that any delay or modification to the 2026 regulations would favor the teams that already dominate the grid. Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes have the financial and technical capacity to quickly adjust to any changes, while Williams, McLaren, and Alpine would have to redesign their strategy from scratch, with less room for maneuver and limited resources to react. The uncertainty surrounding what will happen with the regulations threatens the stability of the sport, and some teams have already begun to express their concerns. If the FIA chooses to make significant adjustments or even scrap the 2026 regulations, we could see a domino effect that would completely change the grid structure and the racing opportunities for the teams that have opted for this new era. The big question is whether the FIA will bow to pressure from manufacturers and larger teams or maintain its stance to ensure F1 moves in a more sustainable and equitable direction. Mercedes has issued a strong warning about the consequences that the possible elimination or modification of the 2026 regulations could bring. The German team, which has been one of the most successful in the hybrid era of Formula One, understands better than anyone the impact that regulatory changes have on the competitiveness of teams. Its message is not only directed at the FIA, but also at the teams that have built their projects around these new rules and could now be seriously affected. Mercedes' main argument is that the cancellation of the 2026 regulations would favor teams with an established technological base, leaving those that have invested in adapting their infrastructure to the new requirements at a disadvantage. Formula One has been seeking greater equality among teams for years, and the new regulations were seen as an opportunity for teams like Williams, McLaren, and Alpine to close the gap with the grid giants. If these rules disappear or are drastically modified, it could lead to a new period of absolute dominance by the most well-resourced teams, something the FIA has tried to avoid in recent years. Another key point Mercedes has highlighted is the uncertainty it would create for engine manufacturers. The 2026 regulations were designed to attract new suppliers, and Audi's confirmed entry is a clear example of how these rules were beginning to yield results. However, if the FIA decides to change course at the last minute, this could discourage other manufacturers who were considering joining the sport. Companies like Porsche have expressed interest in F1, but any sign of instability in the direction of the regulations could cause them to reconsider their participation. Furthermore, from a technical perspective, Mercedes has emphasized that a last-minute change could affect the development of engines already in advanced stages of production. Teams that have opted for the new regulations have devoted considerable resources to designing power units that meet the requirements of the 2026 regulations, including reducing the use of fossil fuels and increasing the proportion of electric power. If the FIA decides to reverse these changes, all the development work carried out to date could be lost, generating financial losses and delays that would affect the competitive balance of the sport. From a strategic perspective, Mercedes' warning also points to potential political tensions within Formula One. Some teams and manufacturers have actively worked with the FIA in creating these regulations, confident that they would represent a step toward the future of motorsport. If the FIA chooses to modify or eliminate them, it would open a debate about the authority of the regulatory body and its ability to establish clear and stable rules over the long term. This could generate distrust between teams and manufacturers, affecting the relationship between the FIA and the sport's stakeholders. In terms of competitiveness, Mercedes' warning also suggests that if the 2026 regulations are scrapped, teams like Red Bull and Ferrari could benefit greatly, as they have dominated recent seasons and have built structures that allow them to react quickly to any rule changes. In contrast, teams like McLaren, Williams, and Alpine, which have opted to evolve based on the new regulations, could find themselves in a difficult situation, having to readjust their plans without the certainty of recouping the time and resources invested. Mercedes' message is clear. Any decision that alters the course of Formula One for 2026 will have profound consequences for competitiveness, team investment, and confidence in the sport's management. The FIA is in a delicate position, where any wrong move could generate internal conflict between teams and uncertainty that would jeopardize the future of the sport. Now the big question is whether the FIA will maintain its initial stance or give in to pressure from some teams and manufacturers seeking a change in the regulations before their implementation. The uncertainty surrounding the 2026 regulations has generated intense debate within Formula One. Throughout the video, we've analyzed how the potential elimination or modification of these rules could affect several teams, with Williams, McLaren, and Alpine facing the greatest risks due to their development strategies and adaptation to the new regulations. We've also seen how Mercedes has issued a strong warning about the consequences of this change, highlighting not only the effects on the competitiveness of the grid, but also on the stability of the sport and the confidence of manufacturers in the future of F1. Now the question is, what happens next? The FIA is at a crossroads, with the responsibility of making a decision that could define the direction of the championship for the coming years. If it maintains the 2026 rules as they are, some teams will have to accelerate their development to catch up with the leaders. If the FIA decides to modify or eliminate the regulations, it could open the door to a new period of absolute dominance by the strongest teams, leaving behind the teams that have opted for structural change. This situation also poses a significant dilemma for engine manufacturers. Audi has already confirmed its entry under the 2026 rules, and others like Porsche have expressed interest in joining the championship if the regulations remain in place. But if the FIA decides to alter the regulations at the last minute, will they still go ahead with their engines? Regulatory stability is a key factor in any manufacturer's decision-making, and any sign of uncertainty could cause them to reconsider their participation. What is clear is that this is not a simple technical debate. It is a power struggle within Formula One, where decisions made in the coming months could change the competitive structure of the sport. The possibility that certain teams will benefit or harm adds an additional level of tension, and we are likely to see even more political statements and strategies in the coming days as each team tries to defend its interests. The future of Formula One depends on what happens with these regulations. The question remains, who will benefit and who will suffer the greatest consequences? The FIA has the final say, but teams and manufacturers have already made it clear that this decision will have long-term repercussions. Leave us your opinion in the comments. Do you think the FIA should maintain the 2026 rules or make changes before they are implemented? Which team do you think will be most affected by this uncertainty? Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest news from the world of Formula One and hit the bell so you don't miss our upcoming analyses on the future of the championship.